Hello, how are folks doing today? Glad to join me. We are here, we are on live. I am here in my hotel room here in Washington, D.C. We are ready to have a conversation. All is good. I'm just making sure that the stream has started going. I see Comsamal says hello from France. Well, hello to you, Comsamal. Glad to hear from you. Glad we are already getting going. But yes, I'm here in Washington, D.C., and I've been covering the anti-racist rally. There were two rallies happening. There was a Unite the Right 2 rally today at the White House. Jason Kessler, supposedly David Duke, though I don't believe he showed up. 24 white nationalists showed up at this rally in front of the White House today on the anniversary of Charlottesville. And there was a response from roughly, I'd say, maybe 10,000, 5 to 10,000 people that came out to counter them. So it was quite a day here in Washington, D.C. Huge protests taking place. The one-year memory of Charlottesville is all in our minds. I was here in Washington doing my job as a reporter, reporting the news, describing what was taking place, and it was quite a day, I'll tell you that much. But what else is going on here? I see the stream is having a little bit of difficulty here. What's going on here? I see it keeps cutting out, which is interesting. All right. But what here is happening? Anyhow, so I'm here just enjoying myself here. And I figured I would get on here and have a chat with folks. Bob Marston, shout out to you. Good to see you on there. Good to see Human. Human says they're all good here. Well, I'm glad to hear that you're good, Human. So one interesting side note that took place. For years, I've been reading the Final Call, the newspaper published by the Nation of Islam. And I particularly wanted to get the issue that came out this week because of the Netflix controversy, right? So Netflix was going to screen a documentary about Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. Just about, this is an iconic organization. Let's remember Minister Farrakhan led the Million Man March. That was like a big, big event. Farrakhan is a very, very well-respected leader of the black community. The Nation of Islam has thousands and thousands of members. They do a lot of very, very important community work. They have a lot of influence in the African-American community. So Netflix was supposed to make this documentary about the life of Minister Louis Farrakhan. And Netflix canceled the documentary. They wouldn't show it, right? There was all this pressure on them that Minister Farrakhan was racist, was anti-Semitic, and so they canceled the documentary. So I saw that this had happened, and I was not happy about it because Minister Farrakhan is a very, very important black leader. And let's also remember that Minister Farrakhan is also anti-imperialist. When the U.S. government was bombing Libya, right? All the socialist communist groups, not all of them, there were a couple that spoke out, but for the majority of the socialist and communist groups did nothing about it. They wouldn't march against it. They thought it was a revolution in Libya. And the Nation of Islam had this event, the Millions March in Harlem, with thousands of people out there to oppose the bombing of Libya. If you read the Final Call newspaper, they regularly will report on events related to the Islamic Republic of Iran. They'll report about China and the Belt and Road Initiative and the role it's having in Africa. The Nation of Islam is an anti-imperialist organization to their core. They are opposed to the global system of monopoly capitalism. It's a religious organization. They have some religious beliefs that, I'm not my beliefs, but it's not for me. I'm white. They don't want to convince me of their beliefs. I'm not going to endorse everything they've ever said. Again, I'm not supposed to. I'm a white guy. But they're a group that is very, very anti-imperialist, has a huge amount of support in the African-American community. And, so with the fact that Netflix canceled their documentary, it upset me, so I tweeted about it. So I was at the rally today, covering the anti-racist rally, doing my job, just kind of covering it. So I saw a guy from the Nation of Islam selling the Final Call newspaper. So I bought it from him. Then this evening, I was sitting down to have some dinner. I opened up the Final Call newspaper, sitting there in the hotel restaurant, eating my meal, and and I almost dropped it because lo and behold, I saw my tweet, the tweet that I made, I saw it right there in the final call, and that blew me away. Like they published my tweet where I tweeted out about how Netflix had canceled the documentary about Minister Farrakhan. So that blew me away. I bought the newspaper completely on a whim, just saw them there, and I've always liked reading it. I buy it on newsstands in New York City. Very good anti-imperialist newspaper. They tend to report on developments in Africa, developments related to Iran. They tend to report on international events as well as domestic events from their kind of anti-imperialist perspective that the organization has. And I bought it, and lo and behold, I saw that they had published my tweet. So I'm honored. I mean, this is a very, very important African-American newspaper. I'm deeply honored. You know, I actually got to go to Iran a few years back with some leaders of the Nation of Islam, Imam Sultan, Nisa Islam, and others, and there was a very important conference in Iran related to the issue of police brutality. So it was quite interesting to see the leaders of the Nation of Islam and how they work up close. I didn't meet Minister Farrakhan, but I met kind of the inner core, like the dedicated staff of the Nation of Islam that went to this conference in Iran related to the issue of police brutality. So that was quite a kind of an interesting experience, and then today, lo and behold, I see that my thing was in the Nation of Islam. So, what else is going on here? We can hear you. That's interesting. I'm not seeing my face coming across in the stream, so I don't know what's going on. I mean, I'm here using the hotel Wi-Fi, so I hope the stream is working out okay. But yeah, I mean, the fact that Netflix would cancel that documentary about Minister Farrakhan it's like, how many documentaries are there about like presidents that we've had that owned slaves or said atrocious things about African Americans? I mean, it's like they're not responsible for everything Farrakhan ever said if they just report on his life. I mean, Farrakhan is a pivotal leader. I mean, like, for example, like Public Enemy. Right, one of the most well-loved like rap groups of the 1980s. They go on and they quote Farrakhan, and they were followers of Farrakhan. Farrakhan was a very, very influential figure in U.S. history. I mean, kind of an icon, especially like late 70s, 80s, 90s when they did the Million Man March. I mean, Minister Farrakhan was the key black nationalist in the United States. He was anti-imperialist when it came to the Palestinians, when it came to Libya. When it came to Cuba, he was always very supportive of the Cuban government, and especially I remember being in Harlem in 2011 when Obama was bombing Libya and seeing the thousands and thousands of people that Minister Farrakhan brought out to protest the war, while all the Trotskyites and the social democrats and the socialist this and the Trotskyite that, almost all of them wouldn't march against it. There was a minority of hardline leftists and anti-imperialists that would march against the bombing of Libya, but the Nation of Islam was out there, and they marched against it. I remember they had a rally in Washington, D.C. against the bombing of Libya. And they told their supporters to oppose it, and they actually, I mean, this was when Obama was president, and they were supporters of Obama, but yet they marched against his bombing of Libya. It's quite fascinating. And, this recent election, 2016, we saw Minister Farrakhan going around telling people in the African-American community not to vote for Hillary Clinton and saying that's a wicked woman, and talking about how Hillary Clinton is tied to these wars and all of that. So that was quite powerful. And we also heard Minister Farrakhan speak very positively of Bernie Sanders. So in the Nation of Islam, a lot of the work that they do, that we wouldn't know about is like in the prisons, they run programs for prisoners. And they help them get off drugs, and they do like rehabilitation programs and entry and exit programs. A lot of the things that the Nation of Islam does are not like overtly political. They're not like leading rallies in the streets, but they're doing things like on a community level to kind of lead their community. And I mean they are really a key organization among African Americans in the United States. And you wouldn't know that. I mean, they have a lot of influence. They have a lot of support. When Farrakhan goes to speak someplace, the place will be packed. There'll be thousands of people there to see him give a speech. I mean, so anyway, enough about that. I just wanted to address that, and I'm just still beaming in pride that my tweet ended up in the pages of the Final Call newspaper. But what else is going on here? I see. What's going on here? I see James Graham says, "Greetings, comrades." Well, greetings to you, James. Good to talk to you. Don't forget to tweet this out. We want people to join the conversation. We always want to join the conversation here. A lot to talk about today, a lot going on in the world today. You should never trust hotel Wi-Fi, use public Wi-Fi, says Ruben Garcia. I don't know what public Wi is. So tell us, what was the atmosphere in the counter-protest, asked Kamsamal. Okay, so Kamsamal, who is greeting me from France, wants to know about the counter-protest. So yes, so I would say, I got there around noon, and I was there until about 6, and so the crowd just kept growing. It just kept growing. It was the Answer Coalition that was kind of, they had the permit, they had the stage, they were handing out signs, and the Answer Coalition was there, and there were a few people that were there early on. It was like a few hundred people at first, but folks just kept trickling in. And one thing that surprised me was, in addition to like the far left groups that were there, right? I mean, like the Progressive Labor Party, an old, communist group. They marched in at one point chanting, death to the fascists, power to the workers. I saw the International Socialist Organization march in big numbers. What was interesting was, in addition to the general like far left atmosphere, there were a lot of folks from just Washington, D.C., a lot of community groups in Washington, D.C., a lot of churches, a lot of like block associations from Washington, D.C. There were a lot of just like local DC residents that were kind of in churches and community groups that came out. And that was interesting to see as well, because you don't usually see people from those kind of organizations engaging in protests, right? They tend to have this attitude that like protests are dangerous and all of that. That was interesting to see. The other thing was, a lot of these black bloc folks, or Antifa or black bloc that came, they were coming looking for a fight. I mean, they had, helmets on, and they had gas masks, and they were ready to go for it. Toward the end of the rally, it started to rain. Actually, it was starting to pouring rain, and when it was starting to rain, the fascists they dispersed or whatnot, and when they dispersed, then there was just this crowd of thousands of people, and so at one point the Antifa folks had kind of seized an intersection, and there's a lot of video. If you look at my YouTube channel, there's quite a bit of video from today. I had a great chat with a young guy, I believe his name was Jason, who was dressed in a Union soldier uniform. He was dressed like a Union soldier from the Civil War, and so we had a chat about the Civil War and Marx and the Second American Revolution. I was able to kind of show the intersection when the Antifa folks had kind of seized it, and had taken the intersection. But no one seems to have gotten arrested. No real violence took place. It seems to have just been, it was kind of, there were 24 of these guys, and I saw the far right from a distance. I wasn't able to get into the cage. The media, I wasn't able to actually get into the cage and interview any of the far right guys, but I did see them from a distance. And what was interesting was they were going to have only American flags and Confederate flags. However, they didn't have any Confederate flags. They only had the American flag, and then one of them had a church flag, like the flag of, like the Christian flag. It was like, it's like a blue cross and a heart or something. It's like a flag you see in a lot of churches. And they were there, and there was only like roughly 24 of them, and they had a sound system, and the crowd was all yelling at them and booing them, and there was an army of cops and a huge barricade, and they were on the other side of it, and the crowd was booing them and screaming at them, and they were there on their sound system, taunting the crowd, taking turns one by one, getting on the microphone and yelling at the crowd and yelling at the protesters, and it was like almost impossible to get to that side of the barricade. Like the whole crowd was just like pressed up against the barricade to shout at them. That's kind of what was happening. One thing I noticed was that among the protesters, unfortunately, there was a lot of these signs about Russia and saying, Trump works for Putin and stuff like that, but there weren't that many of them. Most of the signs were simply denouncing the Ku Klux Klan and the far right. Very few signs that were actually specifically involved in this Russia stuff. And I asked a lot of people, I asked people, do you think that Russia is responsible for Trump getting elected? And most people told me no, actually. Most of the people I spoke to said they're really not thinking about it. I mean, they couldn't, they would give a vague response, like, well, I don't really know about all these bots and trolls, and they would give me a vague answer, but almost all of them didn't buy into the idea that Russia was somehow responsible for Trump's victory, which I thought was interesting, because if you watch CNN or MSNBC, you'd think that that's all that people on the left or people that call themselves anti-racist say. They just sit around hating Russia all day long, and that's just not the reality. There's a gap between what people that have left-wing views think and what the mainstream media, CNN, is telling them to think, and I thought that was interesting. But what else is going on? Russian Orthodox Church pushing hardcore Zionism. I didn't realize that. I don't really know much about the Russian Orthodox Church. I really don't. I do know that a lot of their teaching opposes capitalism, and they talk about how the rule of profits and greed is antithetical to Christian teachings. And the Russian Orthodox Church does hail the defeat of the Nazi invaders as a great moment in Russia's history, and that's actually it was during the Great Patriotic War, what Russians call the Great Patriotic War, that Stalin legalized and brought back the Russian Orthodox Church, and it became once again part of Russian society. It was actually, I believe it was in 1942, that the Russian Orthodox Church became an entity once again in Russian society in the process of fighting and defeating the Nazi invaders, and that the Russian Orthodox Church very much, honors that, and that's one interesting thing, and that the Russian Orthodox Church, they do denounce capitalism, and they say that capitalism is not in line with Christian teachings. But I've been to some Russian Orthodox cathedrals in Russia when I go over there. I've seen it. I don't really know enough about the teaching to really comment on it. I don't know what their position is on Israel, among other things, so I can't really comment on that. But that's an interesting question. But people are asking me different things. What is going on here? Now James Graham says I was just reading about cultural Marxism in the Frankfurt School in the U.S. Is that a political force these days? Well, here's the thing. Okay, so let's back up, right? And I've written a lot about this, but so in 1949. In the USA, the Communist Party, they were all being put in prison. McCarthyism was at full swing. The National Board were put in prison. The Communist Party USA was kind of functioning almost as an underground organization. But then at the Waldorf Hotel in New York City, the Soviet Union, the Soviet diplomats, the Communist Party USA, leftists from around the world were able to stage this really, really successful conference. And it was called the Waldorf Peace Conference. Albert Einstein was there. Will Geer, the actor from the TV show The Waltons, was there. A lot of famous composers, I believe, were there, and it was Frank Oppenheimer, one of the scientists who was responsible for the atomic bomb, was there. All these great intellectuals came to this Waldorf Peace Conference. So the CIA was very frustrated by how many intellectuals in the Western world, in the USA and Western Europe, were supporting Marxism and were sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Because this conference, the Waldorf Peace Conference, wasn't just a conference denouncing U.S. foreign policy. It was blatantly pro-Soviet. It was a pro-Soviet conference, and actually the Trotskyites and the Social Democrats boycotted it, and they put on another conference, a few blocks away, and it was, Albert Einstein, all these people were basically supporting Soviet foreign policy, saying positive things about the Soviet Union at this conference in New York City. So the CIA looked at this, and so they came up with a program they called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and you can Google it, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the idea was to basically funnel money into leftist causes, left-wing, Marxist-sounding stuff that was anti-Soviet. And that's basically what they did. And one of the main operations of the Congress for Cultural Freedom was to fund Partisan Review magazine. Partisan Review. Look it up. And this is common knowledge. I know this sounds a little tinfoil hatty, the idea that the CIA was funding all these things, but Partisan Review magazine, it's widely understood that this Trotskyist magazine, this anti-Soviet, socialist Trotskyist magazine, was actually funded by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. It was all over the campuses, Partisan Review, and they reprinted the writings of George Orwell and Max Shachtman and Noam Chomsky, I believe. They reprinted his writings. They reprinted the writings Susan Sontag, the cultural critic, who's just like an icon of leftist thought. And they reprinted this kind of cultural critique of U.S. society from a Marxist perspective in the Partisan Review. And it was all being paid for by the CIA. And it's likely that a lot of the people who worked for Partisan Review didn't know that. They had no idea where the money was coming from. They just knew it was a job. It was this, liberal leftist magazine they were writing for. But actually, at the end of the day, the money was coming from the CIA. They also promoted the work of Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock was this painter, and he was like a leftist. He'd been, close to the Communist Party in the 30s, but his art was completely abstract. It was just, drops of paint on a canvas. It was just splotches and stuff. There was no actual, shapes or images. And the CIA promoted that and funded that. And that the CIA basically, during the the Cold War, they really tried to fund what they called cultural leftism, or the cultural left, or in some cases they even use terms like cultural Marxist. I don't like to use that term because people on the internet use it in different ways, but basically the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency saw that there was a gap, that Western intellectuals, the kind of people that were becoming communists in the West, they tended to be very, very socially liberal. And the Soviet Union was a very socially conservative country, right? In response to, being invaded and attacked and barricaded, the Soviet Union, out of necessity almost, became a very socially conservative place. I mean, they outlawed abortion, they outlawed homosexuality. There was it was a very authoritarian political setup. It was still a socialist society. The means of production were controlled by the state. They had central planning. They raised people out of poverty. They transformed the country into, a global industrial superpower. But at the same time, they were under attack, and it was not the kind of free, liberal place that a lot of Western intellectuals who were attracted to Marxism thought it was. And so the CIA basically saw this as an opening to kind of create a gap between Western intellectuals and leftists and actually existing socialism in the Soviet Union. And so there was this program, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And when the Congress for Cultural Freedom got going, you got a whole layer of people in Western Europe, intellectuals, the Frankfurt School, and all kinds of, and people in the USA too. And you got the emergence of a kind of a brand of basically what became what people commonly call the New Left. The New Left, what's called the New Left is not Marxism, right? The New Left generally doesn't believe in Marxist economics, does not believe in Marxist economics. The New Left tends to focus on cultural issues. It tends to favor deconstruction. And they pull a lot from Gramsci, and they pull a lot from various Marxist intellectuals, but at the end of the day, they are opposed to Marxism. As far as they're concerned, Marxism is Eurocentric, and the kind of thing that they call postmodernism. This idea the postmodernist thinking, that's rooted in this kind of funding of leftists that were anti-Marxist or anti-Soviet or against Soviet-style Marxism-Leninism, and that's the roots of the postmodernism, the idea that it's competing narratives. And it views postmodernism. The reason it's called postmodernism is they refer to communism, fascism, even Western democratic ideas like Roosevelt, kind of Americanism. They refer to all that as modernity, right? Modernity is the belief that there is truth in the world. Modernity is the belief in historical progress, that history is moving forward. So postmodernism is about deconstruction and tearing things down, right? Tearing apart the mainstream narrative, highlighting other narratives. It's all about narrative. That's their favorite word, is narrative, narrative, narrative. And postmodernism largely rejects the idea of historical progress. It basically argues that no, the world is getting worse, and it rejects the notion of historical progress. And it tends to argue that it tends to equate all the modernist ideologies, right? Communism is just the same as fascism, which is just the same as liberalism, which is that they're all the same, and the main thing is to deconstruct them. That's kind of what postmodernism is about. People will go as far as saying that postmodernists believe that there is no truth. That's not exactly. I mean, they don't put it in those words, but I mean, and that the idea that if you believe in historical progress, if you believe we're moving forward, if you believe that actual truth exists, well, then you're an authoritarian. You're a communist. And I remember Susan Sontag, who's one of these big, postmodernist intellectuals. She got her start at the Partisan Review. She famously said that, communism is nothing but the most successful form of fascism. And her definition of fascism, it's very interesting. She wrote, these critiques of, it's like, I believe she wrote an essay about what she called the fascist aesthetic. And at the end of the day, her definition of fascism isn't like a Marxist definition of fascism. Her definition of fascism is basically anyone who believes that right and wrong exist, people that think that everything isn't just a matter of opinion, people who think that they're on a mission to try and make the world a better place. All of that is fascism. So, of course, communists are just the most successful form of fascists. And any form of kind of, anyone who's trying to advance human civilization, anyone who has a clear set of moral principles of right and wrong, all those people are fascists. That's kind of the postmodernist idea, and that freedom is about deconstruction, right? tearing apart narratives, deconstructing everything. Everyone can just kind of do what they want. Everything's a matter of opinion. That's postmodernism. And a lot of these alt-right or right-wing folks, especially on the internet, like to say that that is Marxism. Postmodernism is Marxism. And really, in reality, postmodernism emerged as an alternative or a force of opposition to Marxism, and the funding for it in academia largely came from forces that were very, very anti-communist, like the Central Intelligence Agency, like the Rockefeller think tanks, the Ford Foundation. The forces that fomented postmodernism are some of the wealthiest capitalists. So I guess that's really what I got to say on that. And I mean, again, people hear me say that and they make it sound like, okay, Caleb, you're saying that every postmodernist is getting money from, is working, is just a CIA agent. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think these people had these ideas, but these ideas were promoted, they were allowed to flourish, and they were kind of pushed by people that had a specific agenda. And that agenda was to counter the rise of like Marxist-Leninist ideas among dissident circles and to kind of break the tie between Western leftists and the anti-imperialist countries around the world. And now that the Cold War is over, I mean, and I've talked about this in a lot of my videos and stuff, now that the Cold War is over, we've really seen the culmination of this, where now the USA presents itself and the Western capitalist countries present themselves as the purveyors of liberal ideas. No more are they attacking countries to protect the world from communism. Now they're attacking countries in the name of human rights, in the name of gay rights, in the name of women's rights. They're protecting people, and these dictators, they always call them that, dictators. That's what they call any country that they attack and invade. They always accuse them of being too right-wing, right? And the purveyor of liberalism is the Western world, and this was starting during the Cold War. In Afghanistan, the USA portrayed the Mujahideen, Osama bin Laden, like they were freedom fighters, and the USA was arming them to help protect these people from the Soviet Empire. And that this kind of narrative where the West, Western capitalism uses kind of, instead of using like right-wing, messaging, like we got to fight the communists, and these people are a bunch of communists, godless atheists, and they're coming to kill us. Instead of using that kind of terminology, when the Western capitalists start using humanitarian rhetoric and start presenting themselves as if their mission is to go around liberating people, and then increasingly they start demonizing anti-imperialist countries on the basis that these anti-imperialist countries are what they are conservative in a lot of ways. And a lot of these anti-imperialist countries are indeed conservative. They're conservative because that's what the planned economy, the planned economy can offer. It can offer people stability. It can defend it can make life, doesn't have the fear. It's kind of a protection from the Western world. So, and the insecurity of Western capitalism. A lot of these anti-imperialist governments do base themselves on that, and that kind of comes with social conservatism. And a lot of times they're not okay with gay marriage or abortion. A lot of times, they tend to be more traditional, even though they preside over state-run, centrally planned economies and are trying to modernize and develop the economy. They still have socially conservative ideas. So, in the aftermath of the Cold War, we've seen this weird point of confusion. But who else is talking to me here? What else do we have? Jonathan Hooker says, shout out to Jonathan Hooker, is something to remember with shaping views of many is that something to remember that not every person in one view is being paid, but it's think tanks and capital toward itself. Exactly. If you ever start walking around saying it's like, oh, all these people are agents, all of them, it's not that simple. It's not that simple. That powerful structures in any society, the powerful structures have a way of rewarding and allowing to flourish the ideas that they like and kind of suppressing and marginalizing the ideas that they don't like. And that happens in any society. I know Michael Parenti, the writer, he wrote a very good book called The Culture Struggle. Very, very good book. And in his book, The Culture Struggle, he talks about how this works. About it's not like people are just they're all agents and they're all just no, it's not that simple. It's that people that say the right things get the grants and get the book deals and get published and get the jobs and the tenured professorships. People that say the wrong things get kind of pushed to the side and marginalized and isolated. And that happens. And that what's weird is that now that leftist ideas are out there, there is kind of a left that is not that is pro-imperialist, pro-war, and basically favors the global capitalist system and sees it as doing good, and are just kind of they favor global capitalism, but they give it kind of a left-wing flavor. And I think that's what's weird about this. It used to be that communism was the enemy, and the Western world was always denouncing communism. But now you get this kind of weird, socially liberal, a special emphasis on social liberalism, that it seems to accompany the belief, of the Western world. And on top of that, there are a lot of people in developing countries who have socialistic ideas but are socially conservative, and that their conservatism their social conservatism walks hand in hand with economic populism. If you go around the world, there will be people in like when I went to Iran, for example. Iran is left wing in terms of economics. I mean, people are provided with housing and jobs and education. Most of the economy is in the hands of the state. But Iran's a very socially conservative place. Religion is everywhere. Women wear headscarves. Homosexuality is not permitted to be just a part of the society. It's socially conservative. But that in the minds of the average Iranian that you talk to, that goes hand in hand with their economic liberalism. They view capitalism as this kind of godless selfishness, right? They say their system is not capitalism but Islam. If you go to Venezuela, for example, a lot of Venezuelan leftists are socially liberal, but among, your rank and file supporters of Bolivarianism, a lot of them are very socially conservative, and they do believe that social liberalism is about kind of deconstructing their country, tearing people apart, tearing down the family unit. You get socially conservative ideas among people in anti-imperialist countries a lot, and that's a new contradiction too, that Western capitalism suddenly is the champion of social liberalism, right? And they want gay marriage, and they want pornography everywhere, and all of that. Meanwhile, anti-imperialist countries with state-run, centrally planned economies tend to be the champions of social conservatism. They're telling people, look, you don't have to be afraid under the Western capitalist system. The economy is just doing whatever. People are left behind. People are starving, but we are developing. We're building up. We're helping, make things better. And so they're offering social stability, and so that leads anti-imperialist governments into a more socially conservative direction. So politics is not exactly, I tell people that the political compass is broken in a lot of ways. People used to have this political compass. They could walk around and go, left, right. Is that more left or more right? It doesn't exactly work that way. It's not that simple. And I've traveled the world and I've seen that directly. And that I think that a lot of the folks that are stuck in the Cold War, one of their problems is that I think that they're under the illusion that the kind of the Soviet style system is going to return, and that's just never going to happen. The Soviet Union's not going to come back, and that Soviet model, it had its successes. There's plenty to learn from it, but I don't think it's going to reemerge. I think there's going to be different forms of anti-capitalism and socialism. We look at what China's doing with socialism, with Chinese characteristics, do what the Venezuelans are doing with Bolivarianism. There are different forms of socialism that are emerging in the developing world. However, a lot of people in the West that are into socialism tend to oppose them completely and just reject them. So it's complicated, and that's why it's a little bit weird. If you say that you're for socialism of the 21st century, that can be saying that you support Bolivarianism and you support what China's doing. But then there are other people that'll say they're for socialism of the 20th century because we don't want to be like those evil Stalinist dictators in the third world. We just want, more of a Denmark, Sweden model. So it's a little bit confusing. All of these words can be very, very confusing. What's going on in the chat? I hear good things about the DSA. You should join them if you want. Well, I can't join any political organization. I'm a reporter, and in order to stay objective, I really can't join any particular group. But DSA has an interesting history. I reported a lot on Cecily McMillan's case when she was arrested and ended up going to prison. She was an Occupy Wall Street activist, and she'd been in DSA for many years. And I remember we had a lot of conversations about DSA and its history. I know, her family had roots in DSA. And the Michael Harrington trend, and DSA kind of emerged, and I've written about DSA. I have an article that should be published very soon, actually, where I get into kind of the history of how, what you could call the Michael Harrington trend. Michael Harrington was an academic. He wrote The Other America, which is a book about poverty that was widely loved by Lyndon Johnson and a lot of liberals. He was in the Socialist Party. He was a good friend of the Trotskyist Max Shachtman. When the Socialist Party ultimately dissolved, he formed something called the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and that eventually became DSA. But DSA, they have a lot of energy now. They seem to have a lot of foundation money coming in. You got Jacobin Magazine, which seems to be pretty closely affiliated to the DSA, and they're pretty open now, too. I think anyone can join the DSA. I think you just fill out a form. I'm not going to join the DSA. It's not. I don't join political organizations at this point. I need to stay objective. I'm a reporter and a journalist. And I really, there are some folks in DSA that I've met that I think are great folks, and I agree with a lot. But there's other folks I've met in DSA that I really don't agree with. And that's the thing. I get the impression the group is a very, very wide tent. So, I mean, there you go. I mean, if you're asking about my particular, I have no intention of joining that group. I wouldn't discourage anyone who wanted to join the group. And especially I feel like if somebody was like like maybe they weren't in like New York City or Washington D.C. or San Francisco, if they were in like maybe a smaller area like like Missouri or Iowa or Alabama or something, and there weren't that many leftists, maybe joining the DSA, which one thing about them is they have a lot of meetups and bowling nights. Maybe that would be a place to meet people. I don't know. I remember when I was, when I was in Ohio and stuff. I mean, it was like you wanted to meet anybody who was kind of a leftist, and the kind of sectarianism that you get in like atmospheres where you have a whole lot of different leftist groups you don't have in local areas. Like all the left people in Ohio knew each other. When I was in Cleveland, all of us, Workers World, CPUSA, RCP, we all knew each other. We all knew each other because we all went to the same events, and there weren't that many of us. It was kind of a small milieu, and that can be how it is. And I wouldn't discourage anyone from joining DSA, especially because it's such a wide tent. I think you can believe, I think you can be a member of DSA and take tanky positions. I think you can be a member of DSA and take really, really social democratic positions. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's a pretty broad tent, but I won't be joining them anytime soon. And ultimately, I mean, the name Democratic Socialism America, I mean, Michael Harrington meant that to contract his vision of what he called democratic socialism with Marxism, Leninism, and it was, I mean, the basis of the group is kind of social democratic, and they will always insist that they're democratic socialists, not social democrats. But if you listen, there's always talk about democratic socialism now, and they always say that means Norway and Sweden, and I would maintain those are capitalist countries that have a high level of welfare programs. They have like a welfare state, but at the end of the day, the economy still functions according to profits. And the funny thing is, a lot of DSA members that I've spoken to know that. They'll tell you, well, yeah, actually Norway and Sweden are still capitalist. They have a good welfare state, but the economy still functions according to capitalism. They're fighting for, a planned economy. But a lot of DSA members that I talk to don't seem to know that. And it's like if you're a smarter, more bookish member, you get one line, and then if you're just kind of somebody who wanted to campaign for Ocasio-Cortez, you get another line. So whatever. I don't even really know. I've never really been to a DSA event. I shouldn't really be commenting on this. So much other things we could talk about. Uh, the Anglo-American capitalists and the Nazis had a strong alliance in World War II. Well, that is absolutely true, especially in the lead up to it, because there was a fear that there could be some kind of socialist revolution in Germany. And the German Communist Party had millions of members, and that there was British and Wall Street support for the Nazis during the Second World, or not during the war itself, but in the lead up to the war. Henry Ford, the owner of Ford Motor Company, one of the first billionaires in the world, interestingly enough, he was a huge admirer of Adolf Hitler. If you read about Henry Ford, he published the Dearborn Voice, and Dearborn was like a suburb of Detroit that was where Ford Motor Company was based. He published the Dearborn Voice, which was this newspaper that was very, very pro-Hitler, and they were giving it out with, the car dealers were required to give out so many subscriptions. And the Ford Motor Company, I mean, there were all kinds of American companies that were really closely tied in with the Third Reich. IBM Corporation, there's a good book, IBM and the Holocaust, that talks about how, the Nazis had a punch card machine, with every concentration camp inmates, information on it. And this IBM was basically the ones that designed this primitive computer punch card machine. People talk about Coke. Fanta Orange was like kind of the drink that they were marketing in Nazi Germany, whereas they had Coke in the USA, but they were kind of doing both. A lot of these things are reported on, and that is absolutely true. One thing I always thought was very strange was, if you talk about the Soviet Union, for example, I mean, the economic successes they had, producing more steel than any other country in the world at that time, more tractors than any other country, taking an agrarian economy, a feudal agrarian economy, and making it a world industrial superpower. No one believes you if you say that. If you say the Soviet Union had economic successes, people just go, oh, you don't really believe that, do you? Everyone knows communism failed. Communism doesn't work. Everyone says that. But yet, in the USA, there's this endless talk about, well, Hitler fixed the economy up, and he did all this good stuff. It's very weird, It's like people, especially the American educational system, there's this kind of almost sympathetic view of Hitler, except he, did the Holocaust and killed millions of people. Everyone knows Hitler. I mean, it's worse than Hitler is the thing people say, or almost as bad as Hitler, or, Hitler's like the measurement, like the definition of evil. But yet there's still this weird desire to like laud economic achievements of the Third Reich. Meanwhile, no one will acknowledge that the Soviet Union ever did anything right. Like if you read American history books, the school textbooks that people have, you would think that the Soviet Union was just one big famine from beginning to end, and that's just the opposite of the case. I mean, the Soviet Union had huge achievements in terms of improving people's lives, bringing running water and electricity and literacy to the entire country, building universities, the world's largest hydroelectric power plant, the Dnieper Dam in Ukraine. Eventually, being the first country in outer space, they invented the AK-47 rifle, one of probably the most efficient weapon ever invented. And what do we all learn in school? What do we all learn? Well, no one ever does any work or invents anything or has a new idea under socialism. Well, clearly that's not the case. Soviet Union did a lot of work. They were producing lots of steel and lots of cement and lots of modern apartment buildings and lots of electricity but you're never allowed to if you ever talk about that in the USA, people just kind of roll their eyes and say, oh, but everyone knows, everybody knows. And it's like, and then they point to some famine that happened in Ukraine, and that proves that the entire Soviet experience was just nothing but starvation and misery, and then they got free. I mean, it's really sad the way people talk about communism. I mean, one phrase that you'll hear a lot is people will say things like Stalin was worse than Hitler. And you have to back up for a minute, because when people make that statement, you want to pause and say, how was he worse than Hitler? Because it was like, we all know what Hitler did, right? He rounded up people on the basis of their race, their ethnicity, Jews, gypsies, others, put them on trains, took them to place, and gassed them to death for nothing other than their race or ethnicity. And even if you read some of the most extreme allegations against Stalin, never will you read him accused of doing that, right? People were sent to gulags, but they were not sent to gulags because of their race or ethnicity. And before they went to gulags, they had trials and they were convicted. Plus, there weren't any gas chambers in these gulags, right? And in fact, most gulag prisoners survived the experience. The idea that anyone could equate Stalin with Adolf Hitler or say that Stalin was somehow worse than Hitler, it just doesn't add up to facts. And that doesn't mean you have to defend everything Stalin did. I mean, anyone who looks at Soviet history will admit to you, regardless of why it was the case, there were a lot of people that ended up in gulags that shouldn't have been there. Right? I mean, people talk about Yezhovshchina and the Great Terror in the country and people afraid and people turning each other in. I mean, there's a lot written about it. There's many different interpretations, but it's like, this notion that somehow you can equate, Stalin, the man who ultimately led the Soviet Union to defeat Adolf Hitler. The idea that you could equate him with the Nazis is absurd. I mean, they weren't rounding up people on the basis of their race or ethnicity and gassing them to death in the Soviet Union. That just didn't happen. There was no Soviet Auschwitz. So anyone who makes that allegation, but it's just a thing you say. And that's the whole thing. In the USA, when it comes to politics, a lot of times people just say things. They don't think about them. They just say them. But you should always be investigating. Someone says cell phone. I don't even know what that means. Us American leftists look today and wed. Don't forget LED light bulbs, says J24, and the light bulb cell phone. That's a very good point. The anti-communism taught in U.S. schools is so saddening and disgusting. It really, really is. I mean, people really just don't have a clue in the USA, unfortunately. The level of anti-communism is very, very extreme, and even the people that claim to be Marxists or espousing communism are terrified of ever saying anything good about the Soviet Union. I mean, it's the weirdest thing. It's like if they say something good about the Soviet Union, oh my God, well then they're a Stalinist. I mean, you're allowed to just think socialism might be a good idea on paper or something, but if you ever say that the Soviet Union was anything but an utter hellhole, if you ever say that anything good ever happened in an actual socialist country, oh God, you can't do that. And it's very, very bizarre. It's very, very, very bizarre. It's very strange. I've noticed that, and but yet people and teachers. I had social studies teachers in high school and junior high who, of course they weren't supporting Hitler, and they would talk about the Holocaust and the horrible crimes, but yet they would bend over backwards to try and make it sound like Hitler had good economic policies and Hitler, improved the lives of average Germans, and it's like they would bend over backwards to say that. Why is it okay to praise Hitler and not okay to acknowledge anything good that ever happened in a socialist country. It's very, very bizarre, and I don't get it. I really don't. The other thing that's weird is now you've got like people like Dinesh D'Souza. I mean, this new movie Dinesh D'Souza made, I don't know how this guy gets away. I mean, so Dinesh D'Souza, the premise of his new movie, The Death of a Nation, is that the Democrats are the actual racists because they're Marxists. And it's just like he goes over like the Democratic Party, which was the party of Jim Crow segregation in the South. Lincoln was a Republican. But all the Marxists were supporting Abraham Lincoln. And I tweet about this all day long. Lincoln was supported by Karl Marx. The Republican Party back in the 1860s was a left-wing party. They took their name from the Spring of Nations in Europe, the 1848 revolutions, the Republic, fighting for a republic against the king. That used to talk about red Republicans, read about red Republicanism, and the radical Republicans. That was, the radical Republicans were the most enthusiastic opponents of slavery. The Marxist movement in the U.S., you should read the endorsement that Karl Marx gave to Lincoln. Read about August Willich, the Union Army general who was a Marxist. Read about Joseph Weydemeyer and the Ohio 9th Regiment, a Marxist regiment of the U.S. Civil War. So this notion that I don't know how he gets away with this. It's just this kind of like, well, Democrats are Marxists and Hitler was a National Socialist and that so liberals are the real racists. I mean, it's just really pathetic, and it's historical revisionism. It's a lack of depth. I mean, it's really a lack of depth at the end of the day, because it's like, anyone who's really studied American political history knows that neither party is what it used to be, right? Both parties have drastically changed and adapted, and right now both of the major parties are changing too. I mean, the Democrats and the Republicans have constantly changed. So any attempt to try and say that to try and invoke the complete heritage of the Republican Party as being one continuous political line, and the same for the Democrats, is not accurate. I tell people, it's funny, in a lot of countries you have like a one-party state, where there's just one party. But everybody knows that not everyone agrees on everything, right? And within that one party you have factions, you have different groups that compete for power, you have different political line struggles, you might call it. Well, in the USA, where we have two parties, and every other party is just treated as marginal and not respected, the two parties are basically, at the end of the day, just labels. They really are. I mean, during the 60s, for example, you had the Kennedy family, very pro-Martin Luther King, anti-racist, and you had Strom Thurmond, George Wallace-type people in the same party. There was the Dixiecrats and the Northern Urban Machines, the Democrats. So at the end of the day, I mean, they were the same party, but they didn't see eye to eye on the issue of civil rights at all. And on a lot of other issues, and the Dixiecrats were becoming more and more socially conservative. At the end of the day, the Republican Party began as a revolutionary party. If this was the 1860s, I would be a Republican. But nowadays the Republican Party is a very, very conservative right-wing political party. So, these things change, and these labels change. And the other thing is that if you're in certain areas, even though we have a two-party system, the country is basically polarized to the point that if you're not in like a swing state, that like, for example, if I live in New York City, if I were a Republican in New York, my vote wouldn't count, right? If I voted in the Republican primary, if I voted for Republicans, wouldn't count. I mean, in New York City, where I live, the Democratic primary is the election in almost every area of the city, right? The Democratic primary is the election, right? That's why Ocasio-Cortez, she hasn't been elected yet, but she won the Democratic primary, so she's going to be elected. Because it's like it's bizarre. And if you are in a Texas, for example, certain red state areas, it's the same way. The Republican primary is the election. And so, it's not as simple as people make it out to be. But at the end of the day, I used to be always like, break with the Democratic Party. People should break with the Democrats. The left needs to break with the Democrats. At the end of the day, I think because both of these two parties are just labels, people should do whatever they think is best. Maybe it would be strategic for far left people to run as Republicans, right? They could run against, mainstream Democrats on their Republican ticket. Right? Or maybe they should join the Democratic Party and do primary challenges, or maybe they should do third party running, or maybe they should have no party. Whatever is best, whatever will most advance their cause is what I think people should do. I don't think there's any hard, fast rules. And there's no sacredness, right? It's all just a strategy. When Karl Marx endorsed Lincoln, he did it because he thought it was the best thing to advance, the cause of workers' rights and the working class in the USA by getting rid of slavery, right? And that was the point. It wasn't some hard, fast rule that you never endorse this or that. And that's the question: is if it will advance the workers' movement to do something, do it, and if it won't, don't. I mean, these kind of, there shouldn't be like moral purity attached to tactical questions like this. That's kind of my feeling. And whenever people start, making it about like, who cares if we actually get anything done, just so long as we feel good about ourselves, that's when this stuff stops being politics and starts becoming a religion, in my opinion. What do you think of libertarian socialist? Well, it's interesting. I know Noam Chomsky and others use that label, but I think a lot of the people that call themselves libertarian socialists, at the end of the day, they're just kind of social democrats or democratic socialists. But it gives them this kind of veneer where they can say that they're anarchists. But if you look at what they do, they tend to just kind of do the same kind of thing that, it's a way to be very, very radical. I think it's important to distinguish, basically the difference, between the three ideologies on the far left. Is not about what goal people have. I think all the far left ultimately has the same goal of a stateless, classless world without oppression, right? A world without coercion and oppression where people can just kind of do what they want, right? That's the ultimate long-term vision. The question is, what do you do in order to get there, right? And the social democrats want to just gradually work within the current system. They see it emerging out of the current system. The Marxists, communists think that there needs to be some kind of seizure of power and the creation of a state-central planned economy and the creation of socialism on the road to that ultimate long-term goal. And then anarchists see it as happening without any coercion and just kind of happening voluntarily with people kind of creating cooperatives and communes. That's the viewpoint among the left. And at the end of the day, it's not about what you advocate. But I notice that a lot of these people that call themselves libertarian socialists, at the end of the day, they're actually social democrats. What they advocate people do is just kind of work, within the current system. They don't advocate any seizure of power. They see socialism as just kind of emerging gradually out of the current order. They think that the West is the most advanced. And so they're social democrats, and they say, well, yeah, but I advocate some kind of anarchist thing. Well, so do social democrats. At the end of the day, anyone who is an anti-capitalist, ultimately the ultimate vision is this long-term ideal of a stateless, classless world, right? I mean, that's in the ideology, this kind of long-term vision of a world without any oppression is the ultimate goal. But the question is, how do you get there? That's the difference between the ideologies, is how do you get there? And so the anarchist wing of things, that was like, you had anarcho-syndicalists that opposed all politics and just wanted to focus on unions and unions seizing individual factories, and you had ultra-left anarchists that favored violent activity in the streets, and you had the cooperative anarchists and Proudhon and others. But anarchism, libertarian socialism was a particular tactical orientation. They were rejecting the goal of creating a socialist government. They were rejecting working within the current system and just trying to make the current system more humane. And they were favoring just this kind of cooperative or action outside of politics. It was a rejection of involvement in political affairs, favoring direct action. That's kind of what defined anarchism. So I guess I'll make that point. What about the Green Party? Well, I voted for the Green Party in 2008. I voted for Cynthia McKinney. And there's a lot of people in the Green Party that I think are great. And I voted for the Green Party other times. I mean, I'm not in the Green Party, but there's a lot of good people in the Green Party. A lot of the stuff that the Green Party says that I would agree with. But again, at the end of the day, the question isn't, it's not a hard, fast rule. There might be a situation where I would advocate people voting for the Green Party. There might be a situation where I'd advocate people voting for the Democrats. Might be a situation where I'd advocate people voting for the Republicans. Might be a situation where I advocate people voting for some other party. I don't think any of these parties are like permanent things, but I will tell you, the way things are now, I don't see the Green Party just kind of emerging to become a new third party. I think what's probably more likely is I almost wonder if the two major parties in the USA, the Democrats and the Republicans, are both on the verge of becoming two different parties. Because within within the Republican Party, you have like the Trump wing that is protectionist, that is into this populism, that focuses on immigration, and which tends to be a little more isolationist. And then you have like the neocon, George W. Bush, Marco Rubio wing, and they don't really see eye to eye. You have your America Firsters and Trump kind of people, and then you have your straight up just neocon, Republicans. And then among the Democrats, you've got the Hillary Clinton folks, the DNC, and then you've got like the Bernie Sanders wing of things, and increasingly these the two major parties. It seems like within the two major parties you have two parties in one that are just kind of fighting with each other, and the energy seems to be in the more extreme wings, but yet the actual power within the party apparatus tends to be in the more moderate wings. And I wonder if at the end of the day we're not going to end up with a four-party system pretty soon. But that would happen. If that were to happen, it would be because the two parties would split. It wouldn't be like some other party, just gaining momentum. It would be like, the Republican Party, when it emerged, it was a split in the Whig Party. Right? The Democratic Party already existed. That was the party of Andrew Jackson. And then the Whig Party broke away, and you had the Republicans emerging. It was within the existing power structure. You had a new formation that came into existence. It's not like somebody just started the Republican Party in their basement and it caught on, and so all these people just started voting for them. That wasn't how it worked. It was within the power structure that existed. Forces realigned themselves, and that's generally how things tend to happen. But there you go. What can we learn from Xi Jinping's The Governments of China in terms of what we can do for the U.S.? Well, not much. I shouldn't say not much. But the book The Governance of China, which I actually have right here, this is volume 2 of The Governance of China. It's about China, and it's about China's foreign policy, how China sees things. There's a section on Marxism in here that's very, very good. There's a section on the Belt and Road Initiative that's very, very good. This is good stuff. This is the cutting edge of Marxism. President Xi Jinping, this is the cutting edge. They're doing it over there. They have been applying Marxism and raising China out of poverty. They've had lots of successes in China by applying Marxism as President Xi understands it, as Deng Xiaoping understood it, as Mao Zedong understood it. However, this is about China. At the end of the day, the kind of socialism that they have in China is called socialism with Chinese characteristics. And socialism in the USA, when it emerges, is going to be socialism with American characteristics. And it's not, we're not going to adopt a Chinese system. We're not going to adopt a Russian system or a Cuban system or any other country. The socialism that emerges here in the USA is going to be based on struggles and contradictions and issues that exist here in the USA. Right, and that's what people have to understand. And as long as the far left is presented as agents of a foreign power or people that believe in some foreign ideology, it's never going to catch on, number one. And number two, as long as people in the USA are LARPing and putting on costumes about Che Guevara or something, it's never going to catch on either. That, we really, in the USA, we should all be, it's important to study Che Guevara and Mao and all that, but we should all be experts on William Z. Foster. We should be experts on, Eugene Debs, Huey Newton, the leader of the Black Panthers. Harriet Tubman, John Brown. We should be studying progressive history in the USA and how the far left and socialists have been influential here in the USA. I'm sure to a lot of folks that sounds, just abominable. They want to just say, oh no, this is an evil country, it's Euro settlers and all of that. And it's like, well, if you want to feel good about yourself, stay there. But if you want to actually change the world, you need to figure out, how you can actually, change the world that you're living in, not just kind of rail and yell against it because you're mad. I'm not going to win any friends for talking that way. Oh wow, I just got myself a super chat. The person, NW98, says they enjoy my work. Well, thank you, NW8. It's a pleasure to do what I do. It really is. Now, Tornado Nick says, the thought that there's some single specific application of Marxism that works in every situation through all ages is absurd. Yes, but that's what a lot of the people that I saw at that rally today believe. I got to tell you, from the different, sects that are out there and the different, there's people that think that they have the one true interpretation and that, it's kind of sad. It really, really kind of is. A lot of those sects really do think that way, and that's why you call them sects, because at the end of the day they're just kind of religious groups. They're not really They're not really espousing Marxism per se, because Marxism is just a social science. It's a way of understanding the world. It's a series of principles that Karl Marx came up with, and that he based, he observed the world, he tried to understand how things were happening, and he developed a set of principles. And Marx was wrong about a lot of things. I actually have a video some other folks might actually want to watch called What Was Marx Wrong About? Because Marx was actually wrong about quite a few things, but the main understanding, the methods that he developed are pretty standard. But Marx was wrong on a number of questions. This isn't like there are holy laws that must be followed under every situation. The point is the world's constantly changing, the situation is constantly changing, and you constantly need to be updating things. And what I've noticed is that almost every far left group in the USA, they basically have what I would call a permanent tactical orientation. There is one thing they know how to do, and that's all they can ever do, right? There's some groups that all they can do is they know how to really campaign for the Democrats. Well, right now, if you think just campaigning for the Democrats is what's needed, no. Now more than ever, people need to be hearing about arguments in favor of socialism and stuff, and just campaigning for Democrats to defeat the ultra right. I don't think that's the answer. There are some groups that have big rallies all the time. They have lots and lots of big rallies. And at the end of the day, we're having big rallies all the time here in the USA. There are millions of people in the USA who've never met a socialist, have no idea what socialists believe. And I got to tell you, if you go to a lot of times people like, InfoWars or Breitbart will go to those rallies and point microphones at people and be like, hey, didn't communism kill gabillion people? And they'll point the microphones at those people and they go, but that's not real socialism. And that a lot of times these people that put on these rallies, all they know how to do is just shout racist at people they disagree with, and they can't actually make arguments in favor of socialism. Now there's other groups that, they put out a lot of really good books, and they sell a lot of books and sell a lot of newspapers and all of that. And I mean, again, is that really going to change things all that much? There needs to be a conversation about what is to be done on the far left. But all of these little groups, all these little sects, they all have about one thing they know how to do. And they've decided that that's all they will do, and that's all that they know how to do. And that's the sad thing. And that at the end of the day, none of what any of these groups are doing is actually what matters. At the end of the day, what actually matters is, if you look at any socialist or revolutionary group around the world, they have political infrastructure. They feed people, they take care of people, they have organizations on a community level. They're playing the role of community organizers. And if you look at when the Communist Party USA was strong, it was because in all the neighborhoods, everyone knew who the communists were. The communists knew everyone on their block. The communists had food programs for the unemployed. They took care of people. The Unemployment Council, which was the method that they used in like New York City and Detroit and Chicago and San Francisco, and the reason the communists were so effective is they had neighborhoods under their control. And if you look at the Black Panthers, the reason the Black Panthers were so successful is they did the same thing with their free breakfast programs and all of that. One of the most rewarding experiences I had is when I was in college. I was an activist in Cleveland, and I got to see there was a black nationalist group in Cleveland, a local black nationalist organization called Black on Black Crime Incorporated. It's like a nonprofit intended to stop black on black crime, but it was black nationalist in its orientation. And if you looked at how they operated, that's like the closest thing to an actual communist party they've ever seen. Even though they didn't believe in communism, they were black nationalists. But if you looked at the way they operated, our Art McCoy was the leader, and that they would have their meetings I think it was every Wednesday night, and they would pack 80, 90 people in there. They knew about all the local issues. If a hospital was closing, if people's electricity wasn't working, police brutality, complaints people had about the rent, everything going on in the neighborhood, they were on top of it. They were discussing it, and they were involved. And they were involved on a community level. And people, if something happened in the neighborhood that they thought wasn't right, they would come to the Wednesday night meeting with Art McCoy and Black on Black Crime Incorporated and talk about it. It was an actual community organization, and they had ideas, they had ideology. They used to do these hip-hop workshops where they would talk about black history, and a lot of Muslims were involved in the group. I think a lot of Christian ministers were involved in the group as well. I know, and then I was white, I would go to their meetings occasionally. I know the different Marxist groups from the area would go to their meetings, but this was a group that actually had what you might call political infrastructure, and that's what groups that actually do change society and carry out socialist revolutions, that's what they tend to do. Is they tend to have whole neighborhoods that they're controlling, where they are the organizers. They're providing services to people. They're caring for people. No Marxist group in the USA is doing anything near that. No Marxist group has anything like that. And that's kind of the problem. But at the end of the day, all these groups have kind of like one thing they know how to do. And in the 1970s, you had the new communist movement, which was an attempt to try and do that, in working class neighborhoods. Didn't really work out because at that point the U.S. standard of living was still so high. But now the economy of the USA has crashed, and so it's a different situation. Now the standard of living is dropping, and people are more interested in socialist ideas than they've ever been in my lifetime. So the potential to actually do this kind of work is much higher. But all these groups that are left over from the 60s and 70s have decided, no, we can't do that. We got this one thing we know how to do, whether it's campaign for the Democrats or stage big rallies or print books and sell newspapers. There's one thing we can do, and that's what we do. And increasingly, on top of that, those groups tend to not really be in touch with what's happening around the world. These groups can tell you up and down what they think about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union isn't around anymore. But you ask them, what about Venezuela? What's happening in the Bolivarian countries? I don't know. They either just denounce it or they don't know. They don't know, right? Or China, right? They either just denounce China, oh, they're not real, or they don't know. And that's the thing, is that these forces, they aren't tied in with what's actually going on globally in the 21st century with socialism, and on top of that, they're not really building political infrastructure. But anyhow, wow, people are asking me a lot of questions here. Tornado Nick, especially Invoking Lenin, What is to be Done? Well, that's a good book. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got about the book What is to be Done was to read it backwards. Now, I know that sounds like a joke, right? It's like, and people talk about like the Beatles, Paul is dead, you're going to read it backwards and it's going to say Paul is dead. That's not what I mean. Read the chapters of Lenin's book, What is to be Done, in backwards order. Because when Lenin wrote What is to be Done, he wrote it, I guess I'll use a gesture here, he wrote it kind of like, he talked about a very, very specific argument they were having about the concept of freedom of criticism. And he then expands, and he expands, and he expands, until you get to the final chapter, and he goes over the entire history of Marxism in Russia, from Plekhanov to that moment. And if you're not in Russia in 1903, when he wrote this book, you have no clue what he's talking about until you get to the end. So read it backwards. Read the history of Russian Marxism, and then read the debate about what he calls terrorism, which is people that advocated adventurist acts of violence. Read the debate about bowing to spontaneity. Read the debate about lending a political character to economic struggles. You can read, that book is very, very key. If you read What is to be Done, it's written in a way that it's hardly accessible. There's a lot of endless references to newspapers with Russian names that no one's ever heard of, and quotations from people. But if you really can kind of dig through it, it's got a lot of content. For example, the term propaganda, right? That's just a widely used term nowadays. It actually comes from that book. And Lenin distinguishes between what he calls agitation and propaganda. And then agitation is just kind of stirring people up to struggle, whereas propaganda is literature that is espousing like the party line, kind of teaching people Marxist ideology. And that's the difference between agitation and propaganda. Well, that comes from Lenin's book, What is to be Done? He talks about agitators and, finding agitators in the workplace. What is to be done is essentially Lenin's writing a book about building an organization, building what he called the party of new type, which was the Bolshevik political model. Now, to be fair, I would say that not everything he wrote in that book really applies. I think that book was written for conditions in Russia in 1903. For example, I think, in that book, it's kind of written on the assumption that most of the population is illiterate, and most of the population could never, ever really comprehend Marxism. It's kind of written on this kind of elitist assumption that made sense in the conditions that it was written in. In Russia at that time, where most of the population was illiterate, where very few people were engaging in the political process, it makes sense why you might operate on the assumption that people can never really understand politics, and that you just kind of have to manipulate the situation. But I think that doesn't really apply. I think that also party of a new type. Party of a new type, and that kind of strict democratic centralist model of organizing. organizing, that very much referred to conditions in which, people were, I mean, if you had a copy of a Marxist newspaper, you could be put in prison for your life or killed or something like that. So people had to operate in a kind of a militaristic discipline. But what's interesting, though, is that party of a new type, and the Leninist theory of a party of a new type, as much as Lenin himself just, referred to himself as a Marxist and a scientific thinker and all of that, that it has kind of a history in Russia. I mean, it was, other Marxists around Europe critiqued Lenin's theory of the party of a new type, and they argued that it was actually closer to like a monastic order than a political party. And people compared it at the time to something called the Old Believers, which was a movement of religious believers who rejected some of the reforms of the Russian Orthodox Church and how they had operated underground and had secret signs and had ways of communicating with the public, and that there was the Decembrist coup against Tsar Nicholas I, this attempt to overthrow him, and that there is a history of like secret societies and clandestine organizing methods and kind of monastic orders, parties that give, Lenin famously said that communists should give the whole of their lives to the party, right? Well, there's a whole history of organizations in for thousands of years in Russia's history that functioned that way. So Lenin was very much taking a lot of these ideas from Europe, the Marxist ideas that were coming out of Europe, and then he was kind of building an organization that wasn't, there was the Menshevik Party, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, that was very much, just kind of like one of these European groups, but Lenin kind of developed the party of a new type that would be more in line with how Russians operated and how Russian society functioned. And so, just like President Xi, is continuing to build socialism with Chinese characteristics, Vladimir Lenin, he built very famously, he built, a Bolshevik or a revolutionary Marxist organization with Russian characteristics. Very much it was in line with a more Russian way of organizing things. There's a whole history of secret societies and people operating in the underground. Dostoevsky, I believe he wrote a book, Notes from the Underground. Long history of, kind of underground, clandestine societies among what they called the intelligentsia of pre-revolutionary Russia. And Lenin very much, he developed an organizational model that worked in the conditions of the country he was in. Rasputin. Well, that's the interesting thing. If you read, Marxist literature, the understanding is that Rasputin was kind of an embarrassment to Russian society, and that he was seen as kind of a con artist, this priest who the czars, the royal family or whatever had been, deeply enthralled with, and that the nobility was so embarrassed they eventually offed him and got rid of him. But there's different interpretations. I think there's even like a movie. There's been like different Hollywood movies about Rasputin. That's an interesting thing. What else are people talking about here? Growing tensions between Russia and Germany. Well, I actually think it's the opposite, because, Russia and Germany are very close to each other. And at the end of the day, all this anti-Russia stuff coming from NATO has just hurt the Germans unbelievably. The Germans trade with Russia. They import a lot of Russian products and goods, and the fact that they're in NATO and they're being kind of strong-armed to go along with a lot of this anti-Russian stuff is not good for them at all. And, there's Nord Stream 2, this pipeline, this natural gas pipeline, where the Germans want to buy natural gas from Russia. And the Trump administration is outraged at them for buying natural gas from Russia. It wants them to buy natural gas from the USA. And that wouldn't make sense. Look at a map. Germany and Russia are very close to each other. However, Germany and the USA are not very close to each other. So for people in Germany to import liquefied natural gas all the way from the other side of the planet doesn't make any sense. I think, in Germany you have Die Linke, you have Alternative for Germany Party, and that a lot of these parties are emerging basically because a lot of Germans feel like by having to go along with the USA and Britain in their kind of anti-Russia crusade, that Germany's national interest is being hurt. And that's true. And interestingly, people want to talk about neo-Nazism and all that. I'm not talking about that, right? I just want to talk about, underlying the rise of Hitler and underlying what came before in World War I. Underlying it was the fact that German capitalists and German bankers have always kind of been, they've never really been part of the club, right? Britain and the USA were the major, imperialist, capitalist, powers that were dominating the world. Germany never got an opportunity to be that. And that, one of the main supporters of Adolf Hitler was a banker named Hjalmar Schacht. And Schacht, he wasn't really a Nazi. He didn't ideologically agree with the Nazis. He just saw them as useful because basically he worked with Krupp and Tyson, the steel company, the Krupps, another big wealthy German capitalist industrial family. He worked with a lot of wealthy Germans who were being pummeled and screwed over by American and British capitalists. And so the Nazi government emerged basically as Bonapartism, as a method for these German industrial capitalists to defeat the communists and kill all the communists. So there was no danger of a communist revolution, but also, not pay back their debts and cancel the Treaty of Versailles and kind of fight against American and British bankers. And that was, the Nazi regime was very much a Bonapartist regime by the industrial capitalists of Germany. But at the end of the day, it's true that the Germans, it does not, the British and the Americans, they don't want them to be equal partners in the global capitalist system. They don't want them to be. And it makes sense. And the other thing that I've noticed is if you go to any anti-imperialist country around the world, you see a lot of German stuff. In Iran, they make their own cars, but foreign cars in Iran tend to be German. If you go to the Bolivarian countries, you see a lot of German products. And that Germany, they're part of NATO, they're part of the Western capitalist system, but, I think among the population especially, there's a little more of an identification with Russia. There is, even though World War II and they're not, people there are never going to be Nazis again, I'll tell you that much. But among Germans in particular, there is a feeling that the American and the British don't really treat them fairly, and that they're kind of the underdog. And that was ultimately the sentiment that led to the First World War and the Second World War. At the end of the day, it just doesn't make sense for Germany to be going along with this anti-Russia stuff. It's hurting their economy. And not just average German workers, but also German wealthy capitalists. It just doesn't make sense for them to go along with this anti-Russian stuff. It's not in their interest, but they're being strong-armed to do it by Britain and the United States. And that needs to be said. Do you think the United States will cause political instability in Iran by arming rebels? Well, they're already doing that. The U.S. government's aligned with Mujahideen Khalq, which is this crazy fanatical cult. The USA, there's all kinds of propaganda broadcast into Iran promoting the Pavlovists that want to restore the Shah. The USA is already doing everything it can to possibly destabilize the Islamic Republic of Iran. There's no question about it. The amount of money spent by the U.S. government in broadcasting propaganda into Iran and trying to foment unrest there. There was that Green Movement back in 2008. And then later, more recently we saw that Iranian Spring where the U.S. government was trying to foment unrest after there were some protests in Iran. And the USA would do anything possible, anything in its power to cause trouble within the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's Wall Street wants to bring down the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? Jimmy Carter, it was said that he was hated because he, quote, lost Iran, right? It belonged to Wall Street and London oil companies, the Rockefellers, BP, and Jimmy Carter, on his watch, Iran, toppled that and set up, an economy that's independent. And they, that they want to overturn the Islamic Republic of Iran, especially because Iran is in the Middle East. It is, it is kind of a center of resistance to Western capitalism. It's aiding the people of Syria as they fight against the terrorist rebels and extremists. Revolutionary Guards are on the battlefields of Syria fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And the role that Iran plays in the Middle East region is kind of a counter to the power of Wall Street and London. And I think they would like to oppose that. The other thing is that Iran, there's a boom in natural gas, a lot of natural gas in Iran. And so Iran, just like Russia, can start selling natural gas in addition to its oil. And Wall Street and London don't like that. We saw, Trump ripped up the Iran deal, but we saw that a lot of European countries are keeping their ties with Iran. And that's a big divide. I think Europe wants to continue to have friendly ties with the Iranians, whereas the USA is looking for a more confrontational attitude toward the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I think that's very, very interesting. But listen, folks, I can't really go too much longer. It's getting late. I worked a long day covering those protests and interviewing folks, but it's always a pleasure to talk to folks. If you get a chance, if you haven't read it yet, get a copy of Getting Rich Without Capitalism. This book I've wrote. I continue to get good reviews on this. Fort Russ wrote a great review on it. People continue to read it. It's not what they expected, and I keep selling them. I mean, I every time I look at the page, I've sold a few more. It's a popular book. It's not what people expect. It's a lot of different essays. Like I just talked on here about Hjalmar Schacht and kind of the underlying sentiment, the division between Germany and Britain and the USA. You know, there's a whole chapter on that. You know, sanctions. I believe it's called Sanctions on Russia, Gas Profits, and the Ghost of Hjalmar Schacht. The book is not just. I think a lot of people think that this book is just, you know, like a love letter to China. Well, I talk about China a lot in there, but I also talk about Russia. I talk mainly about the United States. The book is called Getting Rich Without Capitalism, America's Way Out. It's directed at Americans. So give it a chance if you haven't read it yet. And if you have read it, give it a review, you know. Tell people what you think of it. You know, because I think people are confused by the title. I think people think that it's a book about like how to get rich, like it's self-help or something. It's not about that. It's explaining, you know, the future and how it's really, you know, trying to get people to understand socialism as it exists in the 21st century, and to get people past this idea that socialists just want everyone to be equally poor, and it's all about making people poor. You know, so. There we go, folks. It's a little bit late here. I'm going to look in the comments. Where can I buy it? Oh, it's on Amazon. Amazon. It's on Amazon.com. It's on, you know, different book sales websites, so you can certainly buy copies of it. Folks are saying stay safe. They appreciate my work. I'm glad you appreciate my work. You know, and I like what I do. And we're just trying to speak truth in a world full of lies. You know, I went around, I interviewed folks, I did my job, I covered this rally. It's a pleasure to interact with all of you, and I wish you all the best. So until next time,